and to thank the organizers for the opportunity to address this very important subject. I think yesterday and even in the prior session, if you were here for the one on marine bacteria, regulatory issues are very, very significant in bringing a new product forward, whether it's a single chemical entity as pharmaceutical or cosmeceutical, or as we're going to hear today, if it's a product that affects food, whether it's human or animal. There are a lot of issues that have to be overcome in terms of bringing it to market. And the regulatory issues vary tremendously across different countries. So today, I am happy to have with us Veronica McGuire. She is the Executive Director of Program, Regulatory, and Trade Policy. She's here to speak on the regulatory issues in Canada and food safety. And if I may call you Veronica?
Of course.
Throughout 35 years of her service in the federal government, Veronica's had several senior-level positions in cross-section of organizations, including the Treasury Board Secretariat, Public Works and Government Services Canada, and the Canada Customs and Revenue Agency. Ms. McGuire has extensive experience in leading major change initiatives and in managing policy and corporate functions. Currently, Veronica leads the development of the CFIA's program policy suite and oversees the CFIA's regulatory processes and manages trade policy initiatives related to the agency's international agenda. So I think we will really benefit from her longevity of experience across many different agencies in the Canadian government. In order for us to get started, Veronica, would you please give us a description of your agency and how it fits into the Canadian regulatory network?
Sure, I'd be happy to give you an overview of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So we are the federal organization responsible for food safety in Canada. Our regulations govern the sale of food and any food products across provinces in Canada. And of course, our authority also extends to any food products imported into the country or exported from Canada. We have a broad mandate at the CFIA that goes beyond food inspection. We're also responsible for the regulation of animal health and plant health in Canada. So we regulate disease control issues as well as provisions that govern animal feed. We are part of the health portfolio in Canada. We report to the Minister of Health, and we interact very closely with our colleagues at Health Canada, who are responsible for setting food standards and food policy and oversee issues like food nutrition and quality. We also work very closely with colleagues in the Department of Agriculture in Canada, and that department is oriented around research and innovation, particularly targeted at what you might consider the traditional agricultural sector. Global Affairs Canada is also one of our partners because, not surprisingly, international trade is a very important consideration from a regulatory perspective. And with provinces in Canada. So provinces, as you may know, have regulations at the provincial level, and we have mechanisms to work with provinces across Canada on regulatory issues, whether they affect food safety, plant or animal health. Our focus is on safety, and our general approach across the spectrum is based on science and risk assessment.
Well, that's a very interesting way of leading into one of the most important questions I think we've heard over the last few days, and that is the introduction of genetically modified organisms into the food chain. There is obviously a resistance in some organizations, some countries, such as those that are members of the EU, but also Norway is particularly stringent on declaring GMOs not acceptable. Canada has been at the forefront in terms of allowing GMO organisms and food products into the food chain. How do you see that being safe? You know, what has Canada done to determine that it is safe for consumption by humans or animals?
Well, as I mentioned, our regulatory approach is based on science and rigorous risk assessment. And we also are guided by international standards because there are standard-setting bodies in the context of food safety, plant, as well as animal health. Our focus in Canada is on the product safety rather than the method of production. So, for example, as some of you may know, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States recently approved GM salmon. From a safety perspective, we had a process in Canada to review the request for approval for GM salmon. That took quite some time, as you might expect. It was an in-depth analysis and risk assessment done by a number of departments in Canada. Health Canada examined the issues from a food safety perspective and had a team of risk assessors to review the science and the evidence available to us. Likewise, at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, we did a similar process from an animal feed perspective. And our colleagues at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Environment Canada did an assessment from an environmental point of view. So it was a process that involved competent authorities in Canada from various departments, an integrated process which concluded with the approval of GM salmon in Canada based on the safety of the product.
Was that the first GMO protein source product or fish as opposed to other grains or plants that you might have used?
Yes, it's the first GM animal
Okay.
approved in Canada.
And how long did that process take as you kind of went through and set up the guidelines of what the regulatory process would be from beginning to end?
The regulatory process for novel products is a lengthy one. There's no question about that, and would typically take several years, depending on the circumstances and given the amount of evidence and information available to the regulators. So there's not a hard and fast rule. It does depend on the circumstances of the case, and the product would be assessed from a safety perspective on a case-by-case basis. But the fundamentals remain the same. It's based on science, rigorous risk assessment. And as much as possible, we design the processes to be transparent so that developers and proponents of a new product understand the process as it's managed in Canada, as well as other interested parties, certainly consumers in Canada and other interest groups would have an interest on the review process undertaken by Canadian authorities and the results of that process.
I know in the last few years there's been several directives within Canada to try to minimize the regulatory hurdles and expedite the regulatory approval process. Can you speak to some of these, and in particular the Cabinet Directive on regulatory management, and how you think that is improving the passage of new products into the consumer?
Sure. The Cabinet Directive is a directive that applies across government. It comes from the highest level in the federal system, and it provides guidance to all of us, including our organization, on the approach to regulation. So the first step for us is to assess the risk that we need to address, and to determine whether regulation is the best policy instrument. As I'm sure you will appreciate, government has a variety of tools available to it to address safety or other public interest concerns. Regulations, depending on the risks that we have assessed and how we want to mitigate the risks, may or may not be the best policy instrument. So that analysis is key before we embark on developing or updating existing regulations. There is an in-depth analysis that is required before we introduce or change any regulations. That typically will take a number of years to ensure that all the considerations and factors are taken into account. Again, our analysis from an agency perspective would be driven by science and risk considerations. And consultation is a key element. We at the CFIA undertake pre-consultation even before we start to develop regulatory processes or instruments, and there are formal consultations that take place with stakeholders in Canada, but internationally as well. We will seek feedback from other countries on any regulatory proposals. The final point I would make is the Cabinet Directive requires a life cycle approach to regulation. So developing new regulations and implementing them and enforcing them, as my agency does for food safety, plant and animal health, are important considerations. But the expectation is that regulations do get reviewed on a cyclical basis, and we analyze whether the public policy outcomes for which the regulations are designed are indeed being achieved and at what cost. So it is really a continuous process.
And we discussed earlier in casual conversation about what your agency does and what the role might be for industry in helping forge changes or improvements in regulatory processes and policies. Can you comment on how you engage with industry early on in order to help them move their product forward to the approval path?
Well, our relationship and dialogue with industry is key. And certainly in the agriculture sector in Canada, there are industry sectors that are extremely well organized, that have national associations and representatives that interact with us and other regulators on a frequent basis. So the dialogue between government and industry is key in any regulatory processes, whether it's new regulations or pre-market approvals or novel products and the like. And more in Canada, we're seeing industry dialoguing and having interactions with other stakeholder groups. And I think that's an important consideration, again, depending on the circumstances. But for businesses or industries or developers that are working on particular business interests that might affect a local community or a certain constituency, it would be important for the industry to not only talk to government early on in the process, but to engage communities and pursue meaningful consultation with all the key parties involved. And if I can just make two other points with respect to industry's role and what business can do and is doing, certainly in Canada. The first would be around assurance systems. Certainly, government has a role, but it's not all about government. And many business sectors have developed industry standards, protocols, biosecurity standards that can be extremely helpful in terms of demonstrating safety. Yesterday on one of the panels, there was reference made by a speaker to private certification schemes in certain sectors and certifying bodies that are identified by industry for these private certification schemes. That's something that we're seeing more and more in the food industry. It's not driven by government, it's driven by retailers, by business, but it is an important element from a regulatory perspective because private certification schemes have the potential of minimizing risk. And if we have evidence to suggest that the risks are being well managed and control measures by industry are in place, then the need for government intervention and action, either from a regulatory point of view or an enforcement point of view, would be minimized. The final point is good science and good documentation. I've heard these concepts referred to on a number of occasions over the last day and a half. Again, we will look for your science. We will do our own science, but as I mentioned, our regulatory approach is based on rigorous scientific assessment. And it's always helpful when proponents or businesses have good documentation, good record keeping to engage with the regulator, including us.
Thank you. There was a recent study in the United States that indicated there were over 1,300 laws affecting aquaculture. And one study estimated the cost per acre for meeting those laws and regulations and abiding by that could be over $5,000 US per acre. Has your agency studied the financial burden on the businesses and tried to change how they impose those regulations in order to make it more financially feasible? One of the things in this study indicated that, of course, for the smaller businesses, it's much more imposing to have $5,000 an acre for abiding by these laws, where the production costs were 1/1000th of that cost. So most of the cost comes from regulatory compliance. Has Canada investigated that themselves, and what have you done to try to mitigate any of those financial burdens?
So in terms of aquaculture in Canada, the department that has the lead responsibility is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And I do have two colleagues that are attending the BioMarine session that are from the Department of Fisheries. The CFIA has a role in aquaculture in the sense that we approve feed, as I mentioned. So any fish products used in animal feed. And obviously, given our mandate on food safety, fish products that are destined for human consumption would fall under our mandate. Interestingly enough, the Senate of Canada, which is one of the parliamentary political bodies in Canada, did a study of aquaculture in Canada, and that study, for those of you that might be interested, is available on the Government of Canada website. It includes a review of what is happening in aquaculture across the country on a provincial basis. It also has some comparisons with Norway and Scotland specifically, and makes some recommendations for decision makers as to how to improve and strengthen the overall approach to aquaculture. So one of the recommendations of interest, for example, is one-stop shopping to minimize the regulatory burden that might be faced by businesses who have an interest. But there are other mechanisms generally with respect to costs associated with regulations. Whenever we introduce a new regulation, we do a very intense cost-benefit analysis. Again, we have to assure decision makers of the benefits associated with regulations vis-a-vis the costs. Regulations have to be affordable. We also have a requirement to apply what we call a small business lens. So specifically to do an analysis and to report to decision makers what is the impact on small business. And Canada has adopted a one-for-one rule in regulation. So very simply put, for every regulation that's introduced, one has to be withdrawn from the regulatory system. Still early days. I think the jury's still out.
Can we get to a 2-to-1? Withdraw 2 for every new one
Well,
added?
that I'm not sure. But certainly the impacts on business, and particularly the small and medium sector, is a very important consideration. And for us as regulators, we also take into account the impacts on business. So typically, more and more when we design regulations, we will not bring them into force for a period of a year or more to enable business adaptation to the new requirements. We will typically have a light enforcement period during the early years of the regulation. And more we're doing compliance promotion. So that is really oriented around making the rules more understandable, having guidance available to industry, model systems on what our expectations are in terms of compliance. Obviously, it's in all our interests. It's in business interests as well as government's interests to ensure high compliance rates with any of our rules.
Going back to your small business lens, in the United States, basically, most of the new jobs are coming out of small businesses. I think the estimate is somewhere between 70 to 80% of new businesses are small businesses. They're either 1 to 10 or less. And so clearly that burden of regulatory compliance, it has a much greater impact on those. In Canada, especially with the area of food and food safety, what relative proportion is it of new products coming out of small businesses versus large multinational organizations?
Well, it's a combination. Certainly, there are large corporations involved in the food industry who produce in Canada and who also export all over the world, to the United States, of course, but to the EU as well as to expanding Asian markets. But there is also an important small and micro business sector in the food industry. So currently we are on the cusp of issuing new food safety regulations. These regulations are very much in line with the rules that have been introduced by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States under their Food Safety Modernization Act. And our proposal for the new food safety rules do make a number of accommodations for small and medium businesses. And again, it's in recognition that the large corporations have the infrastructure, the specialists, the lawyers, the consultants that will enable compliance with the regulations. There are companies where it's 1 or 2 individuals that may be importing food from other countries, and obviously their capacity to understand and comply with regulations will not be at the same level. The big companies know us, we know them. We have a lot of relationships. For smaller or new companies or startups, obviously the circumstances are different, and we take that into account.
There was a huge effort, probably 2 decades ago or more, to do global harmonization with respect to pharmaceutical agents, since the regulatory issues across the globe varied so greatly, and it was very hard for large or small organizations to get approval in multiple countries. Do you see that as a possibility going forward for food safety, that we could actually reach a global harmonization set of guidelines?
I'm an optimist. I'm not sure I would characterize it as a global harmonization. That might be a bridge too far. But there are a number of steps that have been taken and are being taken in terms of regulatory cooperation. I think for us to get to a place where the rules and the requirements are virtually the same, be it in Canada, the US, the European Union, that is a complex project, and there's no question it would take several years. But regulatory cooperation is a very important theme for us. And again, one of the recurring ideas that we've heard is international cooperation. No country can do it alone. No regulator can do it alone. We work very closely with our partners in the United States and the EU and elsewhere.
So that said, in the last 30 seconds of our time here, if you had one wish as being in charge of food safety for Canada, what would your wish be, whether it be Canada or the rest of the globe?
Well, that's a great question. The regulatory system is slow. I would wish it to be more expeditious and timely, but not compromise the safety considerations, because that's the bottom line. And fundamentally, if people here, all of you could see regulation as an enabler of innovation and economic growth and competitiveness rather than a barrier, I think that would be a tremendous achievement for all of us.
Oh, thank you, Veronica. I would have to agree with that concept. I think coming from the pharmaceutical side, which was most of my background, and then moving into more of the food safety, people have tended to look at regulatory and government as the enemy. And what I have found is that if you engage early, and you treat them as colleagues as opposed to obstacles, you can usually get through the path much easier. So thank you again, and thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.